Am I cooperating with evil if I receive the coronavirus vaccine? Find out this week on Faith Questions with Father Dan. Is it morally okay to receive the coronavirus vaccine? I answered this question in previous Faith Questions, but this time I've had a chance to do some more research, and I encourage you to go and watch that video first because I treat it on a more basic level, explaining what the church says, and that yes, it is okay to receive the coronavirus vaccine, and that it is also okay to refuse the coronavirus vaccine given that you do not place someone else at risk, right? There's a difference between someone who's primarily spending their time at home and someone who's working in a hospital when it comes to the possibility of risking someone else's being able to receive the coronavirus from us. I'm not going to treat that second question because I don't think that's on the minds of as many people, whether or not I ought to be forced in a way, whether or not I am morally culpable if I don't get the vaccine. I think more people are concerned with, should I receive it and is it a sin if I do? Again, watch the first video, but this is a more in-depth treatment on why the church says it is morally permissible to receive the coronavirus vaccine. So I thought I would get into a little bit more of the science behind what's going on and why it's not really, many people see it as not okay to receive the vaccine. It has to do with the origins of the stem cells that are used in the research and in the production of the coronavirus vaccine. The way it works is once a particular stem cell has been researched and has been developed, it can be reproduced again and again and again. And as you can imagine, that reproduction, that predictability, once a stable and healthy and useful stem cell has been found, there's been a lot of research, a lot of time spent with that line of stem cell, and we know how it behaves, and you make better use of that than we would with something starting from scratch. So two of the stem cell lines, if you will, that have been used in coronavirus vaccines are the HEK293 line and the PER.C6. As you can see, I don't have too much familiarity with the technical language here, but my understanding is that these lines of stem cells have come directly as a result of an aborted fetus tissue. Now, we don't know whether or not that abortion was an induced abortion, whether somebody willingly asked to have an abortion done, or whether it was spontaneous, that it simply happened, and we call those miscarriages. But the point is, it's entirely possible that it is, and entirely possible that it isn't. That information we don't have today, because this happened several decades ago, and we don't know exactly where it came from now. So it's possible that we are making use of a person's body, right? Because as Catholics, we believe that from the moment of conception, the human embryo is a person, that God has infused a soul in that body. And although this talk is not about that discussion, the science and philosophy, I would argue, are in our favor in that fact, that we cannot determine the moment when it becomes a person. No one agrees necessarily that they become a person at birth. The question is, when do they have rights? And for us as Catholics, we believe that we give the benefit of the doubt to the child at the earliest moment we could conceive it being its own person. And so that is the moment of conception. So for us as Catholics, we see this, the idea of these stem cells coming forth from the body of a child as this child being used against their will, without their permission, that their body has been effectively destroyed and made use for science without their permission, which is a grave injustice against the rights of that child. So in that sense, we do not see, again, and it's all based on whether or not this actually happened or whether this was a spontaneous abortion, and we won't know that until the next life. But we have to assume the worst case scenario and that these lines of stem cells have become problematic on a moral level to use them. So there are people who say, no, you cannot use anything that is derived from these lines because there is a cooperation with evil. Now you might think, how on earth is it possible for me to be cooperating with evil? First of all, this took place 40-some years ago. Second, how am I possibly, by receiving this vaccine, cooperating with evil? We have to keep in mind that there are different levels of cooperating with evil, right? If somebody asks you to hold a gun while they rob a bank, that's a material cooperation with evil. You're there, you're helping, there's no denying that that's something that is a reality, that you are cooperating with an evil act. But there are other ways to cooperate with evil. And the technical term for it is formal cooperation, when we effectively give a tacit okay to a particular practice by making use of it or not speaking out against it. There are many examples that can be used here. One example is if we purchase items from a company that uses child labor to produce those items. Whether or not we're aware of it, we are cooperating with evil, because if we don't purchase from that vendor, that evil would not take place. We are helping to perpetuate that evil act, even without being aware of it. And in a world where many of the things that we do and the products we receive are very hidden by layers of abstraction, we very likely do not know the source of many of the things that we get. Although that transparency is starting to take place, especially when we consider food and the kinds of organic food that's out there. But that transparency is not always there. In fact, it's my understanding that a great deal of the cobalt that is used in the production of cell phones, about 60% of the world's cobalt comes from, well, I can't remember where it is, but that they often use child labor to mine the cobalt, and that's a great injustice in that sense. And the question is, how do we avoid that, right? There's so much abstraction going on. How do I know if my cell phone has cobalt? But we can see how that would be considered cooperating with evil. And so there are a couple of ways that we can be cooperating with evil, not just in these examples, but specifically by receiving the coronavirus vaccine. The first is that it encourages that behavior to continue. Someone can look back at the coronavirus and say, well, look at how much good came out of this. Even if we have a moral objection to this fact, they might look back and say, well, look at all of those people who are against abortion, and yet they received that vaccine. And so it lowers the credibility of the argument, doesn't it? When it seems, well, but you made use of this, and this came out as a result of this, of an aborted fetus. That seems to lower the credibility that we have in our argument against abortion. And lastly, it can make us complacent. We can just sort of, okay, well, yeah, I believe this, but I'm not willing to put my money where my mouth is. And we become complacent to what's going on around us and unaware that there are things that we are cooperating with that are truly evil acts. So there are good reasons out there for someone to say, am I truly cooperating with evil? But the fact is, that's not necessarily the case. In fact, in a sense, we would be benefiting from the evil, but not necessarily cooperating with it. But that requires a couple of specific scenarios to be the case. So, first of all, it has to be a very grave situation, which it is. It's a very serious situation for us right now, given the state of the world and the vaccines that are available. There's a very good reason to receive the vaccine. And as a result, I don't think we could argue that the benefits of receiving the vaccine, although there are questions about what are the long-term effects, that's not the scope of this discussion, because that has more to do with the practical than the moral. But the situation is grave enough that the consequences, the results of receiving the vaccine are significant, and we can't ignore that. Despite that, we have to make it known that if there is an alternative, if there's an alternative to, if there's a vaccine that has not been developed using these lines of stem cells, we have to voice that. We have to make it known to our lawmakers, for example, that yes, I am receiving the vaccine because there is no alternative, and it is a grave circumstance. But if there's an alternative, I'm going with that. If it's more expensive, if it's more difficult, I'm still going with it because it's the right solution. That's a hard thing for us to do sometimes as consumers because we become complacent. But we have to be willing to stand up for what we believe in. And in that sense, we can receive the vaccine because it's a grave situation and there is no alternative. Although the alternative, I guess, is to not receive it, but then we'd better be mindful of the moral culpability we have of infecting someone. So in that sense, we have to make our voices heard in some way so that these things don't become more problematic, that we don't encourage this to continue, that we are willing to understand and take the time to educate ourselves as consumers of a product. Where is this coming from? Is what I'm paying for perpetuating evil? And that extends beyond the coronavirus vaccine. But in something like this, we have to make our voices heard. Many of the things that these stem cells are used for, much of that research, is not directly connected to what it is that we are doing in our lives, but what medicines have been developed as a result of these stem cell lines. Are we interested in that information? If we as consumers speak up, more people will report on that information, and we'll have more transparency and a better understanding of what it is that we're doing and be able to express our difficulties in using these stem cell lines into the future. So now is not necessarily the time to reject the coronavirus vaccine for the sake of public health. But it is always a time to speak out against the injustice that has been done against these children who became a part of the solution for us. Yes, it's convenient. Yes, we benefit from it. But we should not continue to perpetuate the evil that has been done. I hope this helps to answer your questions as to whether or not you should receive the vaccine. Take time to think about it, to pray about it, and ultimately make the best decision that your conscience allows you to make. God bless, and we'll see you next time.